Unfortunately, I think the risk of nuclear war is increasing today, and as a number of prominent voices have said, the chance of nuclear catastrophe, that is a nuclear war, are greater today or as great today as any peak crisis moment during the original Cold War, specifically the Cuban Missile Crisis. The fear of nuclear war was particularly intense during crisis moments during the Cold War. And when the Cold War ended, I think there was a general relaxation. The assumption was the risk of nuclear Armageddon had now disappeared. And both the publics and even politicians began to lose interest in focusing on the nuclear danger. The relationship between the United States and Russia as successors to the United States and the Soviet Union appeared to be moving in a cooperative direction. And as a result, the notion that we could have a conflict that would be a US-Russian nuclear war seemed absolutely implausible. And the public itself, both in the United States and within Russia, stopped thinking about the danger of nuclear war. And even in formal policymaking circles, there was less focus on developing nuclear weapons, particularly nuclear weapons that would be useful in the United States against Russia. And Russia was the only major nuclear competitor at that point. And less focus in Russia on developing nuclear weapons for the United States. So at both the official level and the public level, people relaxed. That's a complicated question, and it requires many steps. It's complicated, first of all, because the danger of nuclear war is not simply, as it was during the Cold War, between two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. The risk of nuclear war may be greater today between India and Pakistan, but there is an increasing risk of nuclear conflict or the use of nuclear weapons in a military conflict between NATO and Russia, or Russia-NATO supported by the United States. There's also the risk of some kind of nuclear escalation out of the North Korean conflict. So the complexity is already there for geometric reasons. We've got a larger number of cases or countries where you could get nuclear conflict. And secondly, within terms of the development of nuclear weapons in Russia, in the United States, now increasingly with China, but even with India and Pakistan, we are developing both new weapons as a result of technological advances, including non-nuclear weapons that have an impact on the nuclear sphere, and shifting doctrines, ideas about nuclear weapons. The increased willingness on the part of, for example, the United States and perhaps Russia to think about the limited use of nuclear weapons, that is, the usability of nuclear weapons. So for three reasons: geometric complexity, the increased numbers; secondly, the technological advances, including in non-nuclear weapons, both in terms of delivery vehicles and in terms of cyber and non-kinetic means, and in terms of ideas about how you think about nuclear weapons, whether you use them or not. For those three reasons, the risk of nuclear war, dealing with the risk of nuclear war is more complicated. And you need to find answers at all three levels. I wrote a book 3 years ago which is called Return to Cold War. And in that book I argued that in fact in the context of the Ukrainian crisis, the US-Russia relationship, and by extension the Russian-West relationship, meaning Europe, but particularly the US-Russia relationship, was again characterized by Cold War. It was fundamentally different from the original Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was understood. But in the argument in that book was that it did have some of the characteristics of the original Cold War. I listed 5 at the time, and nothing has changed since then. In fact, Those 5 characteristics, including, first of all, as an example, each side, rather than thinking about the interaction that produced the problem, the dance that we did together, blame the other side almost entirely for what's gone wrong. No introspection. There were 4 other reasons why it looked like the original Cold War. That characteristic was particularly true of the original Cold War from 1948 to roughly 1956, 1957. Those 5 characteristics between then and now have simply deepened and hardened. That's the U.S.-Russia relationship. But international politics, unlike the original Cold War, is not characterized entirely or encompassed entirely by that Cold War. There are many important countries that are not part of it. China is not part of the U.S.-Russia Cold War. Much of the Third World, including representatives at this meeting, Brazil, for example, or that part of the world, are not part of the U.S.-Russia Cold War. Everyone was a part of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. Absolutely. It's utterly critical, because if we lose this last pillar of the arms control regime that we spent 50 years creating, arduously, and sometimes painfully from a political point of view, then strategic nuclear arms control, not just between the United States and Russia, but the prospect of nuclear arms control among the remaining new nuclear powers is dead. And that will be very serious. It means then that all of these characteristics that we discussed in this meeting will run uncontrolled, and that will produce a very unstable and potentially dangerous international environment. Strategic stability will be imperiled. The risk of nuclear war at some level between some countries will increase, and we will be living in a different world. It's not an area in which I claim expertise, but I have the impression that A, nuclear terrorism is a major problem. Whether the nuclear weapon states, including the 9 states now with nuclear weapons, have developed safeguards and measures by which they can guard against nuclear terrorists that would acquire access to nuclear weapons is uncertain. That's where I don't have the expertise. People say that the United States and the Russians claim from their part that their nuclear facilities and their nuclear materials are safe against terrorists, but it's a constant struggle, and it's uncertain what the nature of safeguards are in other nuclear countries, including a country like Pakistan. So I think without question the issue of nuclear terrorism is an important issue today. It probably is not really a question of disarming China, because they have only a small portion of the numbers of nuclear weapons that Russia and the United States have. It really is a question of whether in the future China can be engaged in nuclear arms control. Not disarmament as such, at least not complete disarmament, certainly not without complete US and Russian nuclear disarmament, but in areas where the Chinese now are making progress in developing technologies and in developing forces, nuclear forces, they will become important factors in the US relationship, approach to nuclear weapons. That'll affect the US-Russia relationship. China is already important in the India-Pakistan relationship from a nuclear point of view. So at some point, maybe not in the same way that we think about arms control between the United States and Russia, we do need to think about, and one would hope the Chinese would be responsive to areas of arms control where they could be constructive participants. How do I judge the progress the Iranians may make toward acquiring the bomb? Well, the longer that JCPOA agreement is suspended in uncertainty, and the Iranians are taking steps to put pressure, particularly on the Europeans, to lift sanctions, American sanctions, or compensate for American sanctions, and taking steps that move them in this direction. They have not crossed critical thresholds yet, but it's moving in the wrong direction. And if we lose the JCPOA, by the time that happens, the Iranians are almost certainly going to be within a year of being able to develop a nuclear weapon.